Hi. Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is going to be probably less nerve-wracking than watching the elections, so you've made the right choice. Um, I was going to read, put on a screen Rabbi Nachman's probably most famous saying, which was, the whole world is a very narrow bridge that we all have to cross. And the most important thing is not to make yourself afraid. So this is going to be a not to make yourself afraid evening, 1 hour. So we're going to talk about Rabbi Nachman of Broadslove, specifically one aspect of him, that is his tales. Um, this is a much more complicated topic than it was last week when we talked about the Baal Shem Tov, because in part Rabbi Nachman is a much more enigmatic person that the Baal Shem Tov was. So the Rabbi Nachman was born in 1772. He was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. By the time he, of course, was born, the Baal Shem Tov was long dead, and the Hasidic movement grew from just a few dozen people to a major force in Judaism in Eastern Europe. Not much is known about the youthful years of, or the young years of Rabbi Nachman. I said youthful, but he really died very young. He died when he was 37 years old. And it's absolutely amazing how much he got done in that short period of time. What is known about him, that right from childhood, he had tendencies towards aestheticism. He would regularly fast, even as a young boy, from Saturday to Saturday, sometimes 2 weeks in a row. And it probably didn't do him much good. He married at the age of 13 and went to live with his father-in-law. That was a very common procedure, to get married very young, move in with your father-in-law. The father-in-law then would essentially support him and support his studies. He began to lecture when he was about 20 years old, and he started to attract some people, initially because of his yichus, pedigree. That was a big thing in the Hasidic domain, still is, and the Baal Shem Tov was a revered figure. To be the great-grandson of the Baal Shem Tov was a fantastically big yichus, big pedigree. At the age of 27, he made a journey to the Holy Land, to Eretz Yisrael. Now, we could spend the whole evening talking about that trip of his. It was filled with mystery and adventure and totally ununderstandable phenomena, but that is not what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about his tales, of course. When he came back from Eretz Yisrael, he moved to Broadslove. One reason he moved to Broadslove, because he was disliked in the area of Medzibozh by several of the Hasidic Rebbes there, because for various reasons. First of all, by that time, dynasties were beginning to be formed, where the son inherited the leadership of a Hasidic sect, from his father, and he was very opposed to that and spoke up against that. The second thing was that he was attracting people away from the rabbis in the area. So he moved to Broadslove. And in Broadslove, he began a whole new phase of his life. He burnt all of his writings before the trip to Eretz Yisrael. So there is no record of those, and he started anew. And just around that period when he was started in Breslov to lecture and teach, he acquired a disciple, Nosen or Natan, but he's called Nosen, from Nemirov. Nemirov was a little town close to Broadslove. And Rabbi Nosen became a lifelong follower and emunensis. I like that word. Somebody who really served the Rebbe. And the Rebbe, of course, did his lectures in Yiddish and mostly on Shabbos. So Nosen would listen to every one of his lectures, and he had a fantastic memory, so that at the end of Shabbos, he wrote out the lectures. He checked them with the other disciples who listened to the lecture. Then he checked it with Rabbi Nachman, and it's very seldom that he made any errors, even missing a word. And then he transcribed it from Yiddish to Rabbinic Hebrew, which is a very special formalized Hebrew, and put together these lectures. They are called Likutei Moharan, and that is the major literary work of Rabbi Nachman. It has now been translated into English. It's a massive piece of work. There are over 400 lectures, each probably about 2 hours long. And the translation, which I have, and you have, Matt, a couple of the volumes of it, the full translation of it is 15 volumes. It's really a fantastic work, mostly dealing with Kabbalah, both the Zohar and the Lurianic Kabbalah, and the Torah, and also the Talmud. So it spans over the full Jewish cultural heritage. Now, I will just read you one paragraph from Likutei Moharan, which means the teaching of Morenu Harav Nachman, the lectures or teachings of our teacher, Rabbi Nachman. So here is this one short paragraph. Behold, the Torah is hidden and revealed. The Holy One, blessed be he, is likewise hidden and revealed. In other words, that which is revealed to us is the garment and the outer element, while that which is concealed from us is the inner garment and the inner element. Every person should strive to perceive the inner element, that which is concealed from us. Now, these were important teachings in the Chasidic and Jewish tradition. And in fact, even today, the Likutei Moharan is one of two principal texts for the study by Hasidim. The other one is the writings in Tanya, which is the Chabad Rebbe's, Alter Rebbe's writings. But Rabbi Nachman was not satisfied with the Likutei Moharan. He felt that they were not really understood or effectively absorbed by his disciples and students, of we had a fair number by now. But more important, they were inadequate. This type of teaching that he did was inadequate in preparing the people for the challenges that were entering the Jewish world, namely Haskalah, enlightenment, which brought with it logic and philosophical writings. And it was a big challenge. So Rabbi Nachman shifted to teaching in another direction. He shifted to telling stories, and this was his reasoning. So last week, you may remember if it struck you, one of the statements that the Baal Shem Tov made was the following: we should learn and reflect to the best of our capacity. In other words, use our intellect to the best of our capacity. But when we reach a point where we are unable to make sense of life, we need to substitute faith for understanding. Rabbi Nachman said the same thing, but somewhat differently. He made it much more picturesque. He said, we walk along life mostly along the path of logic. We use logical thinking to navigate through life. But then we reach a chasm, an abyss. It might be emotional, it might be theological, where logic will not take us across the abyss. At that point, we need faith, emunah. And that will take us across so we can continue on our path. Otherwise, we get lost. He has a quote which says, "The source of exile is lack of faith." And by exile, he means physical exile from the Holy Land, but mostly he means exile from feeling a connection to the divine, to the universe as a whole. He says, when we fully understand what's going on, we don't need faith. Faith exists only when the intellect stops providing explanation. Only there does a person need faith. So now he's building up his reasoning. To foster faith that will bring redemption, the task of the teacher and the tzaddik is to foster purified imagination. This, Rabbi Nachman believed, could be accomplished by substituting and nurturing positive fantasy. So imagination is nurtured by fantasy, but we have to have positive fantasy in place of negative fantasy. Such positive fantasy can be fostered by appropriate tales. And that is what Rabbi Nachman wanted to accomplish with his stories. Now, Rabbi Nachman's tales are purely in the realm of imagination. They don't deal with everyday characters, as most other Hasidic stories do. And they certainly don't deal with the Rebbe, as also most Hasidic stories do. As you remember, last week's tale of the Baal Shem Tov dealt with the Baal Shem Tov. Somebody else wrote it, but the Baal Shem Tov was one of the main characters. The tales that Rabbi Nachman tells deal with kings and queens and princes and paupers and beggars, totally from the realm of his and then hopefully our imagination. Now, the peculiar thing and the challenging thing about Rabbi Nachman's tales is the fact that they often end abruptly. That is, no continuation. That, like in the sort of standard fairy tales that we have, like, and they lived happily ever after, or things of that sort. They just stop. And very often, central sections of the tales are missing, and it is up to us to fill it in. In other words, we become in part creators of the story that he's telling. And that's where imagination comes in Rabbi Nachman's thinking. His stories all raise puzzling questions, enigmas, things that in some sense don't, non sequiturs. And again, it is up to us to find continuity in these stories. So he told 13 major stories, of which some of you may have heard some of them, or their names of some of them. They include the stories of lost princes, the humble king, the 7 beggars. They are very long. I was thinking of telling one of them, but like, for example, the 7 beggars took Rabbi Nachman 6 days to tell. So we're not going to go there. They're essentially novellas. So what I will do tonight is pick 3 short stories that he wrote. But I would like to start with 2 tales about Rabbi Nachman, specifically, that he didn't write, that Rabbi Nosson has in his book called Rabbi Nachman's Wisdom. He put together his recollections of his interactions with the Rebbe. And this will sort of illustrate the complexity of Rabbi Nachman's thinking, and the enigmas, the puzzles of his thinking. He wrote this book 10 years after Rabbi Nachman died. And here is the first one that I'd like to, a very short episode. He wrote, "The Rebbe once came inside and said, 'What do you do when a great mountain of fire stands before you? A very great treasure lies on the other side. The treasure cannot be reached without passing through this fiery mountain, and you have no choice but to reach the precious treasure.'" I should mention that there is a lot of talk in Rabbi Nachman's tales about treasure, but he never tells us what the treasure is. Is the treasure in dollars, in euros, in gold, in diamonds? No mention. That again is left to our imagination. I am pretty sure that it's not worldly stuff that he has in mind when he says a treasure. So he says, there it is. We have the conundrum. We have to go through a fiery mountain. The treasure is on the other side. We have to do it. And so how do we do it? After several days, the Rebbe spoke about this again. He said, "It has already been revealed to me what must be done in such a case." And he stops. And he never said what it was. And his disciples already knew that it did not pay to ask him, like, what do you mean by that? He would never answer that question. He had to figure it out. So this is like a koan is in Japanese culture. It really is a koan. How do you do this? And I don't know. I have the Chasidic, the Broadslove literature never goes there. They don't try to explain it. So here is another vignette about Rabbi Nachman. And I believe these are true. Rabbi Nosson says that they're true. A group of students traveling from far away, came to Broadslove to study with Rabbi Nachman. And the leader of this group went up to Rabbi Nachman and said, we have a problem when we come to see you. We travel through many villages, and time comes to say the prayers. And as you know, a prayer has to be said facing Jerusalem. And they asked him, and we don't know which way to face. Well, where should we face? They asked the Rebbe. And the Rebbe said, do you put down your baggage, your suitcases that you're traveling with? Do you put them down? And they say, yeah, sure, we put them down. And he said, well, then face the suitcases. Now, to us, this sounds like a joke. And if we'd stopped there, we'd say, yeah, well, that's a pretty good joke. But actually, Rabbi Nachman never jokes. Everything he says, he means. And then he continues. You should watch your suitcases. You should face your suitcases because if you don't, they may be stolen. And if your suitcases and baggage get stolen, you will be depressed. You won't be able to come to me with joyousness, which is absolutely necessary to learn from me. But then there is another level. If you know Rabbi Nachman's thinking, then you can think of another level that he probably means, and that is that none of our possessions do we own. Everything we own belongs to God. It's God's possessions. And therefore, it is our responsibility to make sure that the possessions are guarded. And so that's another reason that they should face their possession. But he doesn't say that. I'm deducing that, and I'm pretty sure I'm right. He moves in those directions in some other discourses. So, okay, I will now tell 3 shorter tales about that Rabbi Nachman authored. They're not of his major opus, which is in a separate book called Sipurei Ma'asiyot, which again was transcribed by Rabbi Nachman. These were also transcribed by Rabbi Nachman, but they're sort of minor tales, and there are many of them. Many of them have been lost because they were not compiled in a book and published. Well, we'll arbitrarily start with the prince who was a rooster. Now I have to tell you, in the Hasidic literature, you find this printed, this short, relatively short story. You'll find it printed, but in some it is a rooster, and in others it is a turkey. And I imagined that Rabbi Nachman told this story sometimes with turkey and sometimes with rooster. I'll choose rooster. I like roosters better than turkeys. So this is the story. A king and a queen had a son, the prince, whom they loved dearly. He was brilliant, and they were grooming him, of course, to take over the kingdom. One day, the prince seems to have, shall we say, gone crazy. In the middle of the day, in the middle of lunch, he took off all his clothing, completely naked, and he said, "Quack, quack, I'm a rooster." And he went under the table, and he refused to come out. And he wouldn't eat any food they gave him, except he said, "Well, I'm a rooster. You have to feed me rooster food," which is probably, it's not stated what it was, but it was probably soaked corn. And he stayed there under the table, naked, eating soaked corn. And no amount of pleading would get him out of there. So the king called his astrologers and wizards. He has a court of wizards, and they each used all sorts of arguments to get him out, pleading. Nothing. He would not come. He would ignore them. Finally, the king said, well, listen, you wise men, and by the way, I should point out all these stories are he in terms of he and men. That's simply the way it was in the days of Rabbi Nachman, and that's how he wrote them. So he asked his wise men, what should I do? You can't help it here. And one of the wise men said, well, in the far away country there is the wisest of the wise. We all studied with him. He's just incredible. Why don't you ask him to come and offer him as much money as he wants? Well, the king sent an emissary. It took him several days to get to the other place and asked the wise man, and the wise man, well, of course, this is a very good person, this king and that whole kingdom. They said, we'll give you as much money as you want. The man said, I don't want any money. I just want to help. So they came back to the palace of the king, and there was the naked prince under the table. So the wise man, the super wise man, took off his clothing, and naked, he climbed under the table. And the naked prince said, but what are you doing here? And the wise man said, well, I'm also a rooster. Yeah, oh, well, all right. So the two of them naked sat under the table, periodically making a rooster sound like quack, bark, quack, quack, like that. And there they were. After a few days like this, the wise man said, well, I'm kind of sick of eating soaked corn. Upstairs, up on the top at the table, they have steak and roasted potatoes and salad. Why don't we tell them to bring that to pass down some and eat that? And the prince said, but wait a minute, we're roosters. And the wise man said, well, is a rooster less of a rooster if he eats good food? And the prince had to admit, no, he's still a rooster. So they passed down the steak and the potatoes and all the wonderful things that the king ate on the top of the table. And, it clearly was very good. A few days later, the wise man said, I'm kind of cold. I think I'm going to put on clothing. Hey, said the prince, but you're a rooster. So the wise man said, well, is a rooster less of a rooster if he puts on clothing and it's not cold? And the prince had to admit, yeah, that's true. He's not. So he put on his clothing and the prince put on his princely clothing. And they sat there making just, idle rooster talk. And after a while, the wise man said, sitting on the floor here is very hard. Why don't we go up on top and sit at the table? And the rooster said, but wait a minute, we're roosters. And he says, well, is a rooster less of a rooster if he sits at a table and it's comfortable? And the rooster had to admit that it's not. So the two of them got out from under the table, sat at the table, ate with the king, and that's where the story ends. So it leaves, obviously, the question, what's going on here? And what happened after that? And now, on the surface of it, this is just a wonderful cognitive therapy. What is it called? This, I think I'm right. It's called cognitive therapy, but that's not, Rabbi Nachman knew nothing about cognitive therapy. He simply gave the story, and now it is up to us to make sense of it, to see what the teaching is, to see where it could go from here. And so I'd like to stop for a minute or two or a couple of minutes and see if you have any ideas. What are the puzzles in this story? Why is Rabbi Nachman telling this to us? How should, yes, Matt.
I was just, because it's fresh in my mind, I was thinking about Art Green's class and the teaching from the Mayor and Naim about how you have to, in order to raise up sparks, you have to be willing to descend rungs in order to climb back, bring whatever you're raising up back up the rungs. And I think it's sort of about the same thing.
Certainly very consistent with Luriani Kabbalah, and perfectly fine. And what happens after that? I mean, what's going to be the next step here? And anybody else? Any thoughts? I should just add for this one, as well as another story, that the symbolism, and that's sort of fairly standard even before Rabbi Nachman, that the king usually stands for God, and the prince usually stands for the people of Israel, us. And the queen, when she's in the story, stands for the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence of God. So is that, looking at that type of symbolism, does that give us any other hint? And who is the wise man? What's his, where do they come from? Anyway, the interesting point is that none of the Hasidic literatures, even though Rabbi Nachman says you have to figure it out, none of these Hasidic writings actually write about an interpretation. I'm not sure, I'll try to find out whether that's against protocol to write interpretation, but these stories, none of them have sort of an explication. One of the stories has an explication, sort of an attempt, what we're doing here. Art Green's, the tormented master, tries to or does give his interpretation of one of these major stories, major 13 stories. And if you are interested in that interpretation, it's not particularly satisfying. Isn't my interpretation, but he does try to give one. Any other comments? Okay, then we'll give the next story. The next story, all right, let me tell you the story of the treasure. Again, we don't know what the treasure is, but this is a story about a treasure. And in this story, Rabbi Nachman gives the main protagonist a Jewish name. So obviously he's a Jew. But other than that, the story is not a particularly Jewish theme. And none of his other stories have specific Jewish themes unless we interpret it Jewishly. For example, just going back to the Rooster story, we may think of perhaps the becoming a rooster, of the prince becoming a rooster, as the straying of the Jewish people into some stupid modernity or into a weird place. And then the wise man, the tzaddik, brings them back. Possibly. I'm just throwing that out as a possible interpretation. Another one, not contradicting any other, because this is all about imagination. And Rabbi Nachman wants to foster our imagination, because we need to have imagination to transit from confusion to faith. That's the whole issue. That's his whole agenda. So the treasure. There is a very poor man living in Uzhgorod. That's in Poland, now Ukraine. And one night he has a dream. He dreams of a city through which flows a big river, and there is a beautiful stone bridge across the river. And on one side of the river, there is a palace. On the other side of the river, there is a park. And he dreams that at the base of this bridge, on the side of the park, there is a treasure. And so it's a dream. What he's going to do with it? Next night, he has the identical dream. Same place, same dream, treasure under the base of the bridge. Third night, same dream. So now he's really wondering what's going on. Maybe that's really something. Maybe he should go there. Is this place he's dreaming of real? Now, he's of course never been away from Uzhgorod. So he knows some wealthy merchants who have traveled widely, and he goes up to one in shul, after shul, and he says, this is the shul I'm putting in. Rabbi Nachman doesn't go that far to make him Jewish. So never mind. He just goes into their store. I just strayed from Rabbi Nachman's teaching. He goes to the store and he asks the merchant, do you know of a place through which flows a river and there's a stone bridge and a palace on one side and a park? He says, oh, sure, that's Vienna. Oh, Vienna. Where is Vienna? So the merchant tells him it's pretty far, but it's a big, big city. So Yankel decides he has to go to Vienna. So he packs his little pitlich, his little bag, and a small shovel, and he goes to Vienna. Well, of course, you don't just go to Vienna. It took him 2 months to get to Vienna. And he gets to Vienna, he walks along the river, and sure enough, there is the stone bridge that he dreamt about, there is the palace, there is the bridge. So he waits till it's night, because there are soldiers patrolling around the bridge. It's an important strategic place. And he starts digging. And he hardly could put in a couple of shovels full, when the soldier comes, taps him on the shoulder, and says, Jew, what are you doing here? And Yankel says, well, I'm digging for, oh my God, I have to take you to the captain. You're probably some sort of a saboteur. I don't know whether they had nihilists or in those days, but he says, you're a very suspicious character. I have to take you to the captain. So he drags him to the main office and knocks on the captain's door. And the captain says, come in. He says, I have a very suspicious Jew here. I'm bringing it to you for questioning. So the captain says, well, what were you doing at the base of the bridge digging? And Yankel tells him the story. True, I had this dream, and I dreamt that under this bridge in Vienna, there is a treasure. And the captain says, you silly Jew. Who pays attention to dreams? I have a dream, The uncle didn't tell him his name, wasn't asked. I had a dream that in Uzhgorod, there's a poor Jew. His name is Yankel. And at the base of his fireplace, there is a treasure. So you're just, you're a dummy. You don't see me running to Uzhgorod to dig under Yankel's fireplace. So the Jew goes home as fast as he can, which takes him 1 month, and he digs under his fireplace, and sure enough, there is a treasure. And again, Rabbi Nachman stops the story right there. We don't know what the treasure is. We don't know why it was necessary for Yankel to go all the way to Vienna and be told there is a treasure in his house. We don't know what he does with that treasure afterwards. These are all puzzles. These are all enigmas. And so again, it's left to us to figure out what's happening here. It's an absorbing story, and it captures our imagination, which is what he wanted to do, but there is also a message. And, you don't have to come up with an answer now, but you can think about it. But if you have some inkling, let's hear the suggestion. Anybody? Don't be intimidated by the fact that this is being recorded and it's going to be broadcast all over the place. So don't worry. But seriously, if you have any ideas, those are, yes, Matt.
I like embarrassing myself on recordings. I have to say, it reminds me a little bit of the other famous Nachman story about going to Jerusalem and turning back at the last minute, or not going all the way to Jerusalem. The idea that you have to go away to realize that actually what you're looking for is something that you already have.
That's a very good answer. And I think it also connects up because Rabbi Nachman, after he went to the Eretz Yisrael, and he was almost ready to go to Jerusalem, and he never went. And when he left, and he said, whenever or wherever I travel, I always travel to Jerusalem. So this yearning that it's someplace else, yes, I think that's very much the case. Anybody else? Well, then we're ready for my last story for tonight. And that is the story of the tainted or poisoned wheat. So the news comes to the king that the crop of wheat that is now being harvested is tainted, is poisoned, contains poison. And that anybody who eats bread from this wheat or anything, will go crazy. So what should he do? So he calls his advisor, his wise man, and he said, what should we do? So the wise man says, well, let's store up wheat that we have now in the storeroom. We have enough for us to last a year, for you and me. And let's just eat that. And the king says, I don't like that. Because if everybody goes crazy and we're sane, they'll think we're crazy. And it will be like abandoning them. So what I think, what we will do, and being king, he can just say what I suggest. He doesn't have to say what I suggest. He says, this is what we'll do. We'll eat of the poisoned wheat, and we'll go crazy as well, like everybody else. We'll be like everybody else. But before that, you and I will put a mark on our foreheads so that when we see each other, it'll remind us that we're crazy. And that's where the story stops again. Rabbi Nachman doesn't say, and then they put on, and then they did this. Doesn't do that. He just stops the story and lets us figure out what this is about. So since we have a few more minutes, you can, Debbie?
Well, what strikes me about all three of these stories is that they're about people in reflection with each other. So the first one, the man who thinks he's a rooster, it takes another human being to kind of reflect back his reality and move him out of it in a non-jarring way. And then the second one, the seeker meets someone who reflects back to him his own reality of, this place you left is actually where you need to be. And then this one too, it's this relationship of like needing the other person to see who you really are and to reflect off of each other who you really are. So they're very similar in that way.
I agree. This is really, I never thought of it that way, but that's certainly, and yes, it's certainly likely.
And that's not, and none of them are about, you mentioned that the king is God, but these are all about the people, not about.
This is true. And now, anybody else wants to add to this? On the other hand, you see, you can interpret this in terms of God. And maybe that makes sense. So this was my interpretation. Again, I don't know what Rabbi Nachman meant. And I will just tell you that Rabbi Nosson, his assistant, so to speak, missed one of the stories. And so he went to Rabbi Nachman and said, I missed the story. I heard it. I heard one of your disciples, one of your students, names him. He told me what you said, what the second day of your telling was. And Rabbi Nachman said, yeah, that's right. And I can hardly wait till tomorrow when I tell the next sequence to see what happens. In other words, Rabbi Nachman says here that the story just told itself, and he had no idea what it was. But let me give you an alternate explanation then that I was thinking about. And again, I like yours, Debbie, very much, probably better than mine. But here is how God comes in. So the king, let us say, stands for God, and there are the people, and they're going off track. The people are going off track. They're going, say, into exile, which is what happened. And the king could avoid going, the king, God, could avoid going to exile. But according to actually our tradition, the king goes with the people of Israel. into exile, into a place of craziness, the place of irrationality, namely the outside world. So that's another explanation where the king really plays the role of God. And you could reframe all of these stories in many, many different ways. That's where our imagination comes in. So we have just a few minutes left before we go and take a look who is winning and who is losing. And maybe you want to stay here for one of the 7-day stories.
Yes.
So we don't have to face that. So this is one thing Rabbi Nachman said. He's a brilliant man. He said, you are wherever your thoughts are. Make sure your thoughts are where you want to be. See, Rabbi Nachman was a great believer in free will. He says, a person has in his ability to simply choose. If he wants to, he does something. If he doesn't want to, he doesn't do it. Every person certainly has always the freedom to choose in everything. A person acts the way he wants to, and understand this well. Now, this is one of the places where many Hasidic rabbis disagree with each other. Some say, and there is proof text of it in the Torah and in Talmud, that actually everything is predetermined by God. What you think, what you are, what you do. And Rabbi Nachman takes the opposite view. No, it's not. Every one of us makes choices. And this is one example, he says, you are wherever your thoughts are. Make sure your thoughts are where you want to be. Now, do we really have a choice of what our thoughts are? Well, Rabbi Nachman says it depends. You could probably alter you. I'm saying what I think he's saying. He would say, we have some choice in what stories we can tell ourselves to alter where we are. Okay. Now, you wouldn't expect Rabbi Nachman to say this, but he said, let the good in me connect with the good in others until all the world is transformed through the compelling power of love. Now, that's an interesting thought. And what does he mean by love? I think here he means love of God. I don't think he means just sort of nebulous romantic love. He means a common focus of love, which unites us. I think that's the kind of love he has in mind. Another thought, the mind changes directions like the flight of a bird, and it takes a great deal of strength and wisdom to hunt that bird down. In other words, to control the flying bird of our thought, so it doesn't invalidate the difficulty of controlling our thoughts. Now here is a very, I would like to open this for discussion. It is a very well-known quote from Rabbi Nachman. If you believe it can be broken, then know it can also be fixed. He said it sometimes in a different way. If you break it, you can fix it. Now, having broken several things, I know I can't always fix it, but somehow he seems to imply that you can. What do you think? Don't think about the election. Think about Rabbi Nachman's sayings. What do you think there?
I
Mark?
think he's talking about teshuvah, that if you break a relationship, you can turn around and try your very best to fix it. Or if you break your relation to anything in the world, always the possibility of turning around and readdressing it.
Okay, I like that. I'll tell you a story, a personal one. When I was in grade 8 in Košice, that's in Slovakia, there was a custom. We then graduated from sort of middle school to the gymnasium. And the custom was for every student to have a book, and every student wrote into every other student's book some piece of wisdom. And in my book, Betty Balázs, whom I had sort of a crush on in grade 8 in Košice, she wrote in my book, and this has to do with teshuvah and friendship, she wrote, a friendship is like, and she wrote that in Slovak, so I'm translating. Friendship is like a golden thread. It is easily broken, torn apart. You can tie it up together again, but the knot always remains. Now, that's probably not true of teshuvah. You can presumably tie up a friendship without a knot, but maybe not. Maybe not. A knot stays. So that's related to that. Now, I already mentioned the source of exile is lack of faith. There's the source of our alienation from the world we live in is that we lack faith, the kind of faith that he is trying to foster. And of course, he thinks the problem of the modern world is alienation. He already saw that like 200 years ago, more than that. He saw alienation was the problem. And the major problem was that the people have lost faith. Now, here is an interesting statement. I don't know where it came in his life, but I can sort of see, always help those who are being persecuted. Always help those who are being persecuted. In fact, I just want to tell you a little episode. We have 1 more minute to tell this episode. An episode from when he was in traveling to Eretz Yisrael. The usual route went through Istanbul, and the Jewish community in Istanbul helped the travelers who were making a journey to the Holy Land. That was a common thing for Jews to do, especially Hasidim. And then that was the Napoleonic Wars were just really flaring up in that area, and there was a lot of lawlessness. And the Jewish community forbade anybody, they said everybody has to go home, nobody can go from here to Jerusalem, because the danger was that they would be captured by pirates, in which case the community from which they left, that is the Jewish community in Istanbul, would have to ransom them. That was the duty of every Jewish community, to ransom the captives. And maybe this is what stimulated him to always help those who are being persecuted. And of course, finally, he was big on happiness, although we know he struggled with depression all his life. And he said, it is a great mitzvah to be happy always. And so with that, I think we'll finish tonight. It's a great mitzvah to be happy, no matter what CNN or Fox News will tell us this evening. Good night.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody. Thank you, Paul.
Good night.